Hello again, everyone. This is the second Sunday after Pentecost, and our gospel this morning is from the second chapter of Mark. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And Jesus said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food? He entered the house of God when Abiathar was high priest and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and he gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for humankind, and not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Again he entered the synagogue, and a man was there who had a withered hand. They watched him to see whether he would cure him on the Sabbath, and so they might accuse him. And he said to the man who had the withered hand, "Come forward." Then he said to them, "Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save a life or to kill?" But they were silent. He looked around at them with anger. He was grieved at their hardness of heart and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." The man stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately conspired with the Herodians against him to destroy him. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. Blast from the past. Do you remember the WWJD bracelets from the 1990s? They were made of cloth and came in all different colors. And remember, it wasn't cool to just wear one. You had to wear several up and down your arm, both arms. The rainbow color was the most coveted one. WWJD stands for What Would Jesus Do? Those bracelets proclaim to the world that when presented with a choice, we would choose to do what we believe Jesus would do. For kids and young adults, it meant standing up to a bully, welcoming a newbie to your school, being careful about the language you use, or simply being known as the church kid. I remember wearing one myself, though I was in my 30s, but even though I wore the bracelet, I didn't always conform to the code. I didn't always choose to do what Jesus did. Throughout my life, choosing to do what Jesus would do has more often than I care to admit proven to be harder than I thought it would be. Maybe that's true for you too. This passage from Mark shows that the things Jesus chose to do almost always got him into trouble, and that trouble ultimately led to his death. The things he chose to do were often against the law, or at least against the prescribed norms of the day, and his disciples were often confused or hesitant to follow along. The world doesn't make it easy to choose what Jesus chooses. Though Sabbath was a requirement for Jesus and his disciples, for us, Sabbath is a conscious choice, one that our culture would tell us is not a priority. We have to choose to do something with our time that will be life-giving for ourselves and for our family. The Pharisees had set some restrictions around the practice of Sabbath, things people could and couldn't do. But Jesus chose to break those rules, saying, "So the Son of Man is Lord even over the Sabbath." What Jesus is saying is that the rules are not God. Only God is God. Sometimes following God's call means breaking with the norms that have been set for us or that we have set for ourselves. In this particular instance, the problem is not the Sabbath laws. The goal of the Pharisees is to put a stop to Jesus, because Jesus is upending the status quo and the system that keeps the powerful in their place above the poor. The Pharisees and the Herodians, the ones who conspire against Jesus at the end of the text, do not care about keeping the Sabbath. They only care about keeping their privilege. They do not care about the man with the withered hand, what he has suffered, or how healing might change his life. But what about us? Are we choosing to do the things that are good or things that do harm? It's easy for us, for me, to point fingers at the Pharisees and say that what they were doing is definitely wrong. But how many of us can look back and say that we always made the life-giving choices, or that we're even doing it right now? As a consummate rule follower, I cannot always say that I have chosen breaking the rules over following them when following them was always easier. It's hard to imagine that I would choose adhering to the rules over relieving someone's suffering if I had the choice to make, and yet my actions are not always life-giving. Rarely is the choice as dark and sinister as it is presented in Mark. Choosing death over life and goodness and wholeness is much less noticeable most of the time. Often failing to follow Jesus comes in the form of passivity or inaction rather than active rebellion. We may not be plotting to destroy Jesus, but we are frequently oblivious to his commands. Every day we make a choice that reveals who we are and who we are serving. The command in Deuteronomy makes it clear what the choice is: observe the Sabbath or don't. Our definition of what that means may vary, but the command remains: keep the Sabbath and remember why. One big problem the Pharisees had with Jesus was that he was constantly interpreting and reimagining the meaning of the law. And he is asking us to consider what the purpose of the Sabbath is. Why do we observe the Sabbath? Simply put, the purpose of the Sabbath is to remind us that God gives life, and that we are to honor that life with action that is also life-giving. With the command to observe the Sabbath, there is another command that was read from our reading from Deuteronomy. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. The Sabbath has a purpose: to remember the way that God has given life throughout the generations. Jesus is returning to what he believes is the original purpose of the Sabbath law: to promote life, to promote healing, to remove those circumstances that do harm or evil. Jesus' response to the Pharisees, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill, indicates that he disagrees with the premise of their suspicions. By healing the man with the withered hand, he does not break the law in any way, because nothing he does here can be considered work that the Sabbath in its truest sense prohibits. Rather, Mark casts Jesus as honoring the purpose of the Sabbath command. It is as if Jesus is saying that the chief objective of the law in general is to save and preserve life. That's our job too. It is what Jesus has tasked us with. So I ask you, what will your Sabbath look like in the coming week? And all God's blessed people say, Amen. Have a wonderful day. Keep the Sabbath.